Hey everybody, welcome to Skeleton Keys.
I'm Torri
And I'm John Booker.
And together we're going to try to unlock the mysteries of mythology and history in pop culture. And I am so excited about today's episode because we're going to talk about something I love so much.
Torri, when I first became introduced to you and your work, I saw that you had an interest in this subject and said, wow, this woman is quite the onion. So many layers here. What are we talking about today?
We're going to talk about professional wrestling, specifically the WWE. Yeah, I'm a wrestling fan, guys, and I'm not ashamed. I'm proud.
Well, Torri, I've been a wrestling fan for a lot of years now, and I'm here to tell you that if you and your partners want to come and take on me and my partners, I'm more than happy to accommodate you in the four-cornered ring. That's what I'm here to do.
You betcha, brother. I'm going to meet you in that squared circle. I can't even do it.
Yeah, I feel like we both have an interest in this topic. I should say my interest in this topic ran from the time I was about 8 years old until I was about 16 years old. And then it dropped off the face of the earth for me. But then I got really interested when I started looking at pop culture academically. How about you? Was this something like since childhood or?
So it's interesting. I wasn't allowed to watch wrestling because I kind of grew up during the Attitude Era when it was scantily clad women and cursing and blood. So I wasn't allowed to watch it. But I remember just being taken by these characters. And it was only when I became an adult and I became friends with a group of guys who liked wrestling. And then we started having wrestling watching parties. And I got very into it.
Well, I think however we are drawn into these things, you know, when we find something that resonates with us, we sort of go down the rabbit hole. And I know for me, what I resonated with were these idealized figures of masculinity. I was trying to figure out during those ages, what is a man like? What does a man do? I'm supposed to be becoming a man. These guys seem like real men. You know, how do I go about becoming one of these guys? But also as somebody that loves storytelling from such a young age, I think that was the real key for me was I was a lot more interested in what was happening in the narrative from week to week than I was even in the actual physical act of the wrestling. What resonated with you? What was sort of the hook for you?
I think one, I was a theater kid, but the only sport I was good at.
That explains it.
Everything comes together, guys. I was a theater kid. But I was a theater kid, and the only sport I was good at was martial arts. And so wrestling is the kind of Broadway with body slams. But I think, too, I was always kind of taken by The Undertaker and Stone Cold because they were these larger-than-life characters. And that's why I think so many people kind of gravitate towards wrestling is because you can see those characters. You know them kind of right off the jump. You know what that is. And so when they were telling these larger than life stories of The Undertaker coming up from hell, I inherently was like, ooh, what is this?
Yeah.
And it obviously has correlations with stories that have come from ancient times of Hades coming up from hell. Like there's so many correlations. So I think when there's a good story, that stands the test of time, whether it's on Mount Olympus or it's in the squared circle.
Well, you bring up this mythological connection. And I think that's what really got me interested in wrestling again later in life is when I began to study mythology and look at Mount Olympus and Zeus and these different gods and goddesses, I had to ask myself, what is sort of the closest thing we have narratively today? And I don't think there's any competition. I think it's hands down pro wrestling is the most closely aligned narrative system we have to Greek mythology today. I mean, there's a lot of things that echo different areas of that discipline, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find something that was more a modern projection of the archetypal ideas of Greek mythology than pro wrestling.
And I think that might have been partially by design, because I think with Greek mythology and a lot of mythology in general, it's very not cut and dry, but you know what each person represents.
Yeah.
You know that Athena is the goddess of wisdom and war. And you know Hulk Hogan is going to be the good guy. John Cena is going to be the good guy.
Yeah.
You have these characters that you can recognize. And I think Vince McMahon understood this. Now, Vince McMahon is the Svengali of professional wrestling. You think professional wrestling, you think Vince McMahon. And he is the owner of the WWE, which he took over from his father. This is a family affair. And they understood that if you connect these good guys and bad guys in wrestling, they call them heels are bad guys and faces are good guys, that people are going to show up. And the evolution of that, you can kind of see it through the WWE, where when they were first starting out, wrestling kind of had the fairgroundsy history where people thought it was a very kind of lowbrow.
Yeah.
Vince McMahon made a point of making it accessible to children, to families, with the creation of characters like Hulk Hogan, making it accessible for everyone. But even then, he understood that stories evolve. And then you get into stories where you get into the Attitude Era and people are bleeding from the face. And there's like, Jell-O matches with women in bikinis. He understood that these stories, while telling these classic characters, can evolve over time as your audience does.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we can see with the Greek gods, that it evolves and you hear different stories with time and with history.
Yeah, I remember going to see it as a little kid, and we would watch it on television, but we also would go to the matches. And when a wrestler would come out from the back of the auditorium and make their way up to the ring, there was always music. There was always fanfare. This was a little regional wrestling show, so there wasn't lighting like there is now, but there was always fanfare in much the same way that I have to imagine the Romans brought out the gladiators during that era. I also have thought a lot about, and I'd be curious to get your take on this. I've often thought a lot about how wrestling is similar to so many other narrative systems where, in some sense, all of the wrestlers in the WWE could represent a part of one individual's psyche. That inside of me, I have this face and this heel, and they wrestle and they go back and forth. And sometimes this part of me wins and sometimes that part of me wins. Do you see like an archetypal psychological connection with these characters?
110%. And I think that's also why you see the success of antiheroes in the WWE, especially because they're not good, but they're not bad. I think Stone Cold Steve Austin is like the prototype of that, of where he has good intentions, but he might go about them in a bad way. And I think a lot of people gravitated towards him because you might have good intentions, you might go about it in a rough way.
Yeah.
And so I 100% think that they can represent different types, different people that you are and parts of your psyche. And that's why I think it's hard if you talk to wrestling fans to pick a favorite wrestler, because you might like them for different parts of you, if that makes any sense. You're like, oh, I really gravitate towards Stone Cold, or I really gravitate towards my crazy side, towards Mankind. That can happen. And I think that is a testament to the characters and to the types of stories that they're telling, that they're very simple, but they're stories that resonate with everyone.
Yeah. Well, every episode we bring a skeleton out of our closet. And I have one today that, wow, it still stands out as one of the more embarrassing moments of my life. But I was really into this North Texas Regional Wrestling Association when I was little, called World Class Championship Wrestling. And the heroes of this particular regional association were a family of brothers named the Von Erich family. And only one of them went on later to become part of the WWE, and he was known as the Texas Tornado. He had just a small little run, Kerry Von Erich. There were 5 brothers, and it really ended tragically for all of the brothers except for one, Kevin Von Erich, who's still alive. But I worshipped the Von Erich brothers as though they were deities, and we would go and see them. And one year on April Fool's, my father and brothers ran into my room and told me that Carrie Von Erich was at our front door, that his car had broke down and that he was at the front door. I jumped up out of my bed in my little underoos and made a beeline for the door, screaming, Mr. Von Erich, Mr. Von Erich, wait, just don't go. And then they had a good laugh at my expense when I made it to the door. It took me years to get over this moment of grand embarrassment where my fanboying over the Von Erichs and specifically Carrie Von Erich just took a extreme moment and caused me great embarrassment. So that is a skeleton from my closet I'm sharing today. And I'm glad I can finally talk about it, Torri.
I think that shows a lot about who you are as a person. You wanted to help. And
I'm a very trusting individual.
I think that's a compliment.
Okay, I'm glad you can see some light in that story.
Always.
How about you? Are you prepared to bring us something from the closet of Torri Yates-Orr today?
Yeah, I was a little bit older. This is embarrassing. So I love wrestling. And like I said, I got very much back into it as an adult. And I actually had a wrestling podcast for a couple years called Bear Hug It Out. If you listen to that podcast, you know some of the characters on there. And we all went to SmackDown in Nashville one day. And there had been rumors that The Undertaker was going to be there. And The Undertaker was the character that I was drawn to when I was a kid. And so I'm there in Bridgestone Arena in Nashville, and I hear the gong, which is alerting me that The Undertaker's about to come out. And I immediately start crying. Mind you, I'm like 28. I'm a grown-ass woman. And just, it's like one single tear just coming down my face like, he's really here. And my co-host, Brandon, the Nighthawk, just turns. He goes, "Are you crying?" And I was just like, I didn't think this moment would ever happen. So
there's no shame in that.
That's my story.
There is no
Thank
shame.
you.
Well, I'm glad we both had this moment of, granted, they were a little further apart in our lives.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. But I'm glad we both had this moment where we were so taken with our passion for wrestling that it caused us public humiliation. But that is the price you pay sometimes for fandom and love. Am I wrong or am I right?
You are not wrong, sir.
Well, I think we could go on for hours about the different archetypes that we find in wrestling. One of the things that I think is really interesting, while we're mainly focused on the WWE in this episode, obviously there are regional wrestling associations all over the world, really. And I think we can compare something here to specifically Greek mythology in that you would have these big archetypes, these big gods that people would build temples to Athena or Dionysus. But you also had these regional gods, and you had these regional temples that were built specifically to a god who was concerned about that area of Greece. And I think that is a really interesting connection to the way that wrestling works on a regional level as well, because I know for me, when I was growing up, I was aware of who Hulk Hogan was. I was aware of who Ric Flair was. But I was far more concerned about the gods of our local North Texas region, the Von Erich family, and some of the gods from our region, like one of the heels that wrestled for years there was Kamala, the Ugandan giant that eventually went on to WWE fame. King Kong Bundy, another character that started in the North Texas region and moved on to bigger things. Let me ask this. What do you think is the reason people are drawn to regional gods as well as these big archetypal gods as well?
I think the archetypal gods are something that joins all of us.
Yeah.
We all can relate to that. But there is something about that's my God or that's my guy.
Yeah.
Like they understand where I'm coming from. They understand my people. Yeah. There's something about that is a base instinct.
Yeah.
And you can see it both in mythology and in wrestling where people don't like having their god or their guy change from what they think of them. I know I can think of one off the top of my head. Finn Balor in the WWE came from New Japan, where he had a very different kind of rock and roller persona. And when he got to WWE, people were upset that had gone, that he had lost that part of him, which I think happens when you kind of get absorbed into those bigger archetypes.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's since gone back to that because that was very popular and his core group loved that. But I think you can see that with gods where you're like, well, I love this regional god, but it can be absorbed into these higher, like you said, bigger archetypes.
Yeah.
It happens. That's the nature of the game. But I think there's something about identifying with these regional gods or wrestlers. It almost feels more precious.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I also, again, because you do have such deep knowledge of this subject, I'm going to interview you here a little bit because I know you think about these things. And I am also curious about representation in wrestling. I know there are characters that identify as women. I know there are characters that are people of color. How about when it comes to gender and sexual identity and things like that? Are there wrestlers who are openly gay? Are there wrestlers that are openly lesbian? Are there wrestlers that are non-binary as far as how they identify? Where is pro wrestling at with a lot of these issues of intersectionality and representation that we find in culture today?
I think wrestling is getting there. It's by no means where it should be. There are a number of wrestlers who are openly gay or openly lesbian. Sonya Deville in the WWE is openly lesbian. I haven't seen it done, especially in WWE, where their stories are told without derision or without kind of playing it for laughs or people who are gender nonconforming or have different sexualities. There's definitely a way to go, especially on the bigger stage, but I think they're making their way there. But on the indie stage, in like these regional, these territorial things, there's definitely more of a space for that, where wrestlers are gay and it's not the defining part of their character.
Yeah.
They just happen to be gay. But I still think that it's evolving. It's not where it should be, but they are making steps.
Interesting. I have also noticed just in sort of my becoming interested in wrestling again and having attended a couple of live events, live evenings of wrestling in the last year. One of the things that I really have noticed is when I go, I see tons of people bringing replicas of the belts and dressing up, sort of cosplaying some of the characters. I can't help but, again, think about some of these festivals that would take place in ancient Greece, these ritualistic festivals, the mystery schools, and different times in Greek history that masses of people would get together and form audiences to participate in rituals that were loud and sometimes violent, and that would involve props. What do you think is going on with the belts and the cosplaying, and the audience almost becomes a character in the narrative?
I think it's very similar to what was happening in ancient Greece.
Yeah.
It's that connection to the god of I'm a part of this. I'm a part of a bigger story. And listen, especially in the wrestling fandom, the fans who carry around the belts get a lot, maybe kind of made fun of. And I never understood that because I understand it from like not an academic standpoint, but I understand you're just trying to reach what these people have achieved.
Yeah.
And like their success is part of your success. But I think especially in pro wrestling, the audience is a character.
Yeah.
There's so many entrances that if you don't have the audience, like the entrance can't happen.
Yeah.
Adam Cole is a wrestler and he literally does this thing where he just says, Adam Cole, baby. But the entire audience goes, baby. hooray with him. And if he did it by himself, it wouldn't work.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for some reason, the audience loves it and you become a part of something bigger.
Yeah.
Even the people who you can tell are not big fans of him join in. You kind of get this like hysteria of like, I want to be a part of something bigger. And I think that's something that they were doing in ancient Greek times of I want to be a part of this bigger entity that I see before me. I want to emulate that. I think that's a natural thing for any of us to do.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of the things that we would hear people that attended these events that wrote about them historically. One of the words that often comes up was this euphoria that actually would go through the crowd during these rituals and during these celebrations and festivals. And I think that's exactly the emotion that I would ascribe to what I see in a lot of wrestling audiences is this sense of euphoria that is only possible when you get that many people together.
Yep. And I think it's something that grows. Like we were talking about regional gods and going into the major gods. That, like, for instance, the Adam Cole example started in the Indies. And then people realized how fun that was and how that made people feel. And it became huge on the main stage. Yeah. I just think there's just something about having all those people in specifically one space that you do kind of get wrapped up in it. You know, listen, every wrestling fan knows that the outcome is predetermined. Yeah. We know. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't resonate. Yeah. They're telling stories that have resonated for centuries. Yes. For millennia. So you get wrapped up in it. You feel this euphoria when you're in the stadium or the arena. It's something very special, but you do I always feel like a worshiper of Sasha Banks if she's out there.
Well, it's that time in the podcast when we share a key piece of media, a book, a comic, a TV show, a song, something that has resonated with us recently. And Torri, what is your key that you are providing for everyone this week?
I'll stick with the wrestling theme. I will go with Glow. If you have not watched Glow, what are you doing with your life? It's so good.
It's so good.
It's so good. So good. Like, it had its own business being as good as it is, but I would say go with Glow. I just think the characters are really well done. They've done a really good job in making sure that it sticks true to what wrestling is. Yeah. I can tell bad wrestling, having watched enough of it. They're not doing it. They're actually, you have good people teaching them all the ropes. But I would go with Glow. Glow is my skeleton key for this week.
Oof, that is a good one. I am going to go with a much lesser known film or TV show, and it's an old documentary that's called Heroes of World Class. And it is a documentary that is about this regional wrestling association that I used to be really into, the World Class Championship Wrestling Association that the Von Erich family owned and operated as well as played the heroes in. I think one of the things that really strikes me is in this, it's not a spoiler, that the Von Erich brothers, all except for one, all died tragically. 4 of them died because of suicide. And it's very, very tragic to see what became of their lives. And it always challenges me to think about mental health and about no matter how much success someone has, mental health doesn't care about that. And we've seen so many people in the world that their lives have ended in tragedy because mental health was not available to them. And I hate, that where I grew up in Texas, mental health wasn't taken seriously, and it was not something that there were resources to be made available. And there were a lot of people who suffered as a result of that. So I recommend that is something to watch that's interesting. But my skeleton key is really all the many resources that are out there for mental health for people, because I feel like especially those of us that love these narratives in pro wrestling, it's often because we're wrestling with something ourselves, inside of ourselves. And if you're listening to this out there and you need someone to talk to or you need help, please seek that out. Every human life is valuable. Every person is a treasure on this earth. And we need you. We can't do this human thing without you. So please seek out the help you need. Torri, I'm also so thrilled and glad today that we have an amazing guest. Dr. CarrieLynn Reinhard is a scholar. She's a writer. She's a thinker. She is the president of the Professional Wrestling Studies Association. And man, I could sit and listen to her wax eloquent about matters of pop culture, but especially pro wrestling all day long.
I'm so excited. My sister in wrestling.
Well, let's get right to it. Let's go to our interview with Dr. CarrieLynn Reinhard, president of the Professional Wrestling Studies Association.
First, I have to say thank you for being on here. I think the world of wrestling, we need more women in it. So it's always good to see a fellow sister in this. So I guess I have to ask, what got you into professional wrestling?
It's weird because I wasn't a fan when I was younger. My brothers, my dad never really watched. I hung out with some guys in high school who watched, still didn't care much for it. And it wasn't until I met my most recent partner, and he was a huge fan when he was growing up. So he would always talk about it. And I was like, I don't know. There's a lot of racism and sexism and some horrible stuff in there. But then I saw Mick Foley on The Daily Show, and I'm like, well, wait a second. He's interesting. He's not a racist or a misogynist. And then my partner and I started talking about the nature of professional wrestling. And from an academic perspective, you start talking about like it from like postmodern ideas of it being this simulation of reality and whatnot. And that's what really got me interested in it. That and watching the documentary about Mick Foley showing how he went through his life and all of the stuff he's done to himself. And I had to give him props for all that. So,
wow.
Literally, the man almost killed himself. I can't even count how many times.
Yeah.
Several times. And you were speaking in approaching wrestling from an academic standpoint. And I'm sure you've kind of come up against this. A lot of people don't think of pro wrestling as a very highbrow academic institution. So when you're bringing this up to people who might not be the typical fan, how do you explain your approach to it?
Well, the benefit, I guess, of having Donald Trump as president right now is the fact that I can always say the president of the United States is a WWE Hall of Fame member, and he's done a lot of things in professional wrestling. And usually that starts to get people thinking, oh, wait a second, there's maybe something here to all of this. But it is... We start kind of with that, but that's only one angle to it. Then there's all of these other angles you can bring in about what professional wrestlers are doing on social media is similar to what celebrities and everyone else is doing on social media, about how it relates to performance and theater and all these other aspects of entertainment, how the issues that it wrestles with in terms of race and gender and sexual orientation is what societies and cultures are wrestling with. So we have a lot of different ways to show those overlaps.
And obviously on this podcast, we talk about how pop culture intersects with myth and history. Where do you see the intersections with pro wrestling? I think it's quite obvious that archetypes are used throughout the wrestling world. We all can spot the bad guy, the foreign bad guy. They're everywhere. But how do you think they kind of correlate?
A number of different ways. Roland Barthes was one of the first people who did analysis on professional wrestling. He was doing it from a very particular perspective, but he was also talking about in his book, Mythologies, how you have these types of stories and archetypes and tropes just repeat and how they're playing out in this more generalized spectacle kind of broad strokes way. The same type of issues that human beings are dealing with every day. And that's the same type of stories that we've seen in our mythologies throughout human history. And then I think you can also look at it, and people have, in terms of more of a folklore perspective as well, and how those archetypes start to become not just like the larger Jungian sense of archetypes, but you do get more regionally based versions of it as well when you look at independent wrestling and more national, like around the world type specific culture archetypes too. So I think there's a number of different ways that it intersects. And to me, the whole thing is that These are just stories about humans. These are stories about us trying to figure out what is this thing we call life. Call out to Prince on that. So I think professional wrestling is, as long as we get past this idea that, oh, only stupid people like professional wrestling because they can't tell it's not real. As soon as you get past that, you see all of the different ways in which professional wrestling is just like any other pop culture or even cultural text, really.
Absolutely on it.
I had a question for you, CarrieLynn. I went for the first time in probably 30 years to go see wrestling just a few months ago, and I was blown away. It was quite a spectacle to behold. I was really amazed in the 30-year gap that I had in going to see wrestling, that the role of women in wrestling had changed a great deal. When I used to watch wrestling as a kid, maybe a wrestler would have a sidekick or a sort of persona that walked them into the ring. But I would say maybe 40% of the matches in the night I went actually involved women wrestling in the ring and with their own storylines and their own personas. What happened in those 30 years? How did wrestling take those big jumps forward?
Well, first, can I ask you, where did you go? Was it a big time show or an indie show?
Yeah, it was a WWE SmackDown, so it was a pretty big show.
Okay. That helps me understand the context, because we still do see differences in terms of how the women are handled in different promotions. Like WWE is still famously not allowing intergender wrestling, for example. But I do think you have a lot more women who grew up watching wrestling with their brothers, fathers, or just on their own. And they became inspired by the wrestlers that they saw. So like Sasha Banks always talks about how like Eddie Guerrero was one of her big inspirations. And Bailey talks about like all of these people who are in her inspiration. And you have those women who are essentially having male role models. And some of them have female role models too. But you have women recognizing that this is not a competition based on physical skills so much as it is based on agility, improv, timing, and then on more of the kind of choreography type skills. And I think that's helped a lot of women too, to recognize that, hey, this isn't something where it's the strongest or the fastest. It's just the one who's willing to put in the work and to do the work. And work here is the idea of, the performance. So I think a lot more women are accepting of that idea. And I think a lot more fans are accepting of that idea as well, and not thinking that women's matches are lesser because they're not able to maybe do all the things that men can, but they do things differently. They have their own value. I think the fact, too, that we saw a lot more rise of women in the indie circuits, both American, Mexican, and then in Japan as well, which has also helped, because now we have a lot more women who have actual wrestling skills and have more performance skills. And it's not like they're just pretty women who are being brought, and maybe they can do a couple moves, but usually they can't. And then they're dangerous to have in the ring. You actually have women who have gone through the training, who have put in the work. And that's, I think, really inspirational. But you also are seeing, like with the WWE, recognition that the fan base is also becoming far more diverse as well, which is really helpful and really helps to back up this idea of giving women more showtime. Now, WWE is still not great about that. And I think in ways NXT for certain, AEW even, are better. But I think that we're seeing an overall trend towards more acceptance and more desire to see it. And I kind of think that the Glow Netflix series is kind of helping that right now, too, because people are really getting interested in the characters. And if you can do good character work, you can have a better career now, it seems, too.
And kind of piggybacking on the women's issues, we've been seeing a lot, especially kind of in the wrestling news now, how race is kind of coming back into the fold, where we have specifically a lot of African-American wrestlers kind of speaking up. Do you think these tropes that have been in wrestling since the beginning are ever going to end or evolve?
For the PWSA on our blog, we have a woman who's been writing the Nylons and Midriffs column. And what she's doing is she's looking at WWE primarily, but she just started looking at not just SmackDown on Raw, but NXT and AEW to look at how women are being portrayed. She takes a very intersectional feminist lens when she does so. So she's been talking through these issues about how in the WWE, they might not have the same type of tropes that they had in the past, but they tend to still have the bitchy betraying relationship that tends to be their main trope for women. And they do tend to push blonde white women more than anyone else as well. That's not the same in NXT and AEW. I mean, AEW right now, their first women's champion is Japanese. And NXT, it's currently she's biracial and she's also lesbian. So we do see more diversity there, and we see the breaking of stereotypes and tropes in, I think, these other promotions. I don't see WWE getting away from that anytime soon. And that just might be my pessimism about WWE right now. The fact that they did have a women's wrestling match at their most recent crown jewel in Saudi Arabia is great. It was two blonde white women. So there is that. But I think until maybe they get rid of total divas, I don't think the tropes are going to change much for WWE. I think if NXT women start getting more popular, and if AEW women start getting more popular, maybe they'll stop with all of their stereotypes and everything. But I'm just not sure. I'm not sure how long it's going to take before they do that.
I think it's kind of been there. And I love WWE. That's what got me into wrestling. But I think they are stories that have been told so often that they're almost like go-tos. Like, we'll just go back to that because it's what they know.
Yeah, it's kind of like lazy creative. I think it was Laurinaitis or someone who once said that you can tell this, just wait like 7 years or something, you can tell the same story again because all the people who grew up on it will have moved on. And they are really kind of stuck in these creative loops, which you don't see to the same extent on NXT, although I'm really starting to worry that that's going to occur more now that they're in prime time. And that's essentially the third main roster.
And especially going up against that AEW, they might be like, yeah.
Yeah, and AEW keeps winning those ratings, which probably is not making McMahon happy.
No, and I think we have to ask, too, Vince McMahon is always and forever going to be wrestling. He is pro wrestling to so many people. I don't want to say like what kind of archetype do you think he fits in, but I guess that it would be kind of my question of like the Svengali over the puppet master over everything. Do you think that the Vince McMahons have a place moving forward in wrestling and in storytelling in general?
Okay, so like in terms of one person who owns and operates behind the scenes?
Exactly.
I do think having general managers are good if they are actually managing things and aren't just like standing on the sidelines. Like William Regal on NXT is wonderful. What's interesting is when I look at AEW, they don't have kind of like that one person at the top. They have a little bit more of a decentralized hierarchy where, you know, it's Omega, the Bucks, and Cody at the top, but they seem equal in that power level. And they're doing interesting things in terms of story by not really, they're really good if they are, but it doesn't really seem like they're putting on a performance as much as McMahon does when he comes out, if that makes sense. Like McMahon, the person behind the scenes seems to be somewhat different, not totally, but somewhat different from McMahon, the man who struts down to the ring to do whatever. There seems to be a slight difference there. But right now, the way that AEW has set it up, it doesn't seem they're doing that. So the tropes that McMahon, I mean, he grew up kind of playing on the capitalist who you want to overthrow, the boss that you want to overthrow, kind of that kind of trope. But he doesn't really criticize that in the behind. It's like that's supposed to be a heel character, but then he totally embraces that behind the scenes. Whereas with Cody and Omega and the Bucks, it's very different what they're doing. And I don't really see it fitting into tropes like that. And it's even interesting because I'm not even sure they're totally fitting into the heel face tropes either, which is really fascinating.
Do you think McMahon in some ways has historically been seen as sort of the Zeus archetype, where he interacts with all the other gods, but he's still the one pulling the strings. He's the head. He's in control of Olympus. Are there similarities there, or do you think it's different?
Makes me think now that maybe Triple H is Apollo too, but
Golden Boy.
Ooh, I like that.
yeah, the Golden Boy who comes in and shines at everything, makes you happy. And then, yeah, I think that's interesting. I think the idea of McMahon as Zeus kind of makes sense in the sense of he's one of the old boys. He's one from the, I can't remember my Greek mythology now, the Titans. Literally, he's one of the Titans who dictates what his children can do. Mm-hmm. And then his children being both biological and metaphorical, as all of his wrestlers, the sense that he's actually in their heads and scripting their dialogue for them is, yeah, everyone always says that's definitely a McMahon joke that's coming out. And then the sense that he will lay the literal smackdown on people as if shooting a lightning bolt if he doesn't like what you're doing. So what he did with Sean Spears and taking away the ability for him to do the 10 chant because it was getting too over, that kind of stuff is him laying the smackdown. It's my way or nothing is essentially, it seems, with him sometimes.
Do you see any other, direct correlations between the gods of Olympus and some of the characters in professional wrestling?
This is a really interesting question. I think we often in WWE for the women, they focus on an Aphrodite. They really try to push that. We don't really see a lot of Athena, which is interesting, but definitely Aphrodite.
Although I feel like sometimes you could argue Charlotte has Athena qualities in terms of being so associated with her father.
Yeah, sometimes. But then, I mean, they focus on her appearance way too much.
They do.
Yeah. And when she got breast implants and everything too, that didn't help that aspect. I mean, I think Becky might be more Athena because she's definitely more the warrior. And Shayna Baszler would be in that regard. Asuka was for a time, but they've done weird stuff with Asuka. I'm trying to think of the men, though. I mean, you do see, what's his name? Bacchus? Is that how I say it? The god of wine? How do I say that?
Yeah, Bacchus, Dionysus, yeah.
Yeah, Dionysus. I think you do see like those types of more fool type characters. To an extent, the New Day is kind of playing that right now. And when Aaron Stevens was there backing up The Miz, he was playing that too. I think the idea of having Vince's fascination with these big, large, muscly, physically capable men definitely fits in like with Aries and the idea of these really aggressive, almost id monsters like Braun Strowman right now. So I think you can definitely see some overlaps. I'm trying to think of like who Hermes would be. Her would be fast talkers, actually. So I think like Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens and those people would be more of the Hermes.
It seems like also they're in a lot of the storylines. In mythology, we have these shapeshifters who will transform from one archetype to another. And it seems like in wrestling, that is a tried and true tradition of the bad guy becomes the good guy, the bad girl becomes the good girl.
Yeah.
What do you think's going on there?
Well, a lot of that is kind of like just soap opera storytelling. At some point, you need to have a face turn or a heel turn if you want to freshen up a character, freshen up a storyline. So, for example, I'm actually doing analysis on my favorite two guys right now, Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa. And it's been interesting to follow them because I've seen them here in Chicago live, but then to follow their story trajectory as they went through NXT and the extent to which you have a definite heel turn. You have the idea of going into the darkness, but coming back. It's very Orpheus, essentially. And then now with what happened to Ciampa and happened with his neck surgery, and they start to reposition him outside of the ring as a face, he comes back as like this revenging god or something, and people love him again. They're no longer booing him when he shows up. So a lot of that is to keep things fresh and keep things moving. And as long as you have good creative and you have the actors and the wrestlers who can actually pull it off, it's great. But when you have someone like John Cena, who can't really pull it off, great guy, can't really pull off that type of performance, then it doesn't work. And you're going to have people who are supposed to be cheering for a hero, booing for a hero. So it can be a delicate line to walk. But when it works, it's really, the emotional investment is amazing.
I got to ask, just selfishly, who is your favorite wrestler of all time? That's hard. I'll give you 3.
Okay. So again, I'm more recent to this. One of the first wrestlers I really liked was The Miz, and I still really like him because he's really good at the character work. He's gotten better at the wrestling, but he's very good at the character work. After The Miz, it was Sami Zayn, because again, the character work in being that baby face and the struggle he was in for the NXT Championship was just amazing. And then it is Tommaso Ciampa, because the ways in which he goes from face to heel, and the emotional expressions and intensity he produces, I think is just remarkable. And if I had started watching earlier, I probably would have really loved Mick Foley just because of what he was doing. But I love Mick Foley as a person now, not necessarily as a wrestler, I would say.
Gotcha. Well, we won't keep you so long, but I have to ask, where do you think we'll see wrestling moving forward?
It's really fascinating. I never thought we would see this much on primetime television. We had, for a while it was SmackDown and Raw on primetime, and you had Lucha Underground, which I loved, but it was on a more obscure cable channel. The fact that you now have 4 shows on primetime in big cable networks is amazing. And on top of that, you have NWA coming back, doing interesting things through streaming on YouTube. You have all these other indies and global federations that have either their online streaming sites or they're using Vimeo or YouTube or things like that. I think it's actually having a really good resurgence. And I think that resurgence, the way it's going to be able to keep going is if it does push back against the more negative tropes and stereotypes and kind of break out of these boxes when it comes to creativity. I was at the first All In. I was at All In. So before even AEW. And my partner and my friends were with me. And my partner would say, that is the loudest crowd I've ever heard. The amount of energy in that crowd was insane. And we're going to the AEW show here in Chicago next week. And it'll be interesting because it's the same place. It'll be interesting to see just how much energy it still has, because watching the shows, the energy level is amazing. And that's the fan that you want to have right now. So as long as that type of fan continues to be invested, I think we're going to see more change coming in terms of the stories and the characters.
CarrieLynn, you are amazing. If people want to learn more about your work and follow you on the socials, where can people find you and continue to sit at your feet and learn?
Well, okay, so for the Professional Wrestling Studies Association, of which I'm the president, we have our official website, which is prowrestlingstudies.org. We have our first academic journal coming out this April for WrestleMania. And we're hopefully at that same weekend doing our first online symposium. So you can find all that information there. You can also follow us on Twitter at the PWSA. I myself am on Twitter as at Media Oracle, and my website is playingwithresearch.com.
Wow. Well, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you giving us some of your time today. We love, love, love finding other members of the nerd, geek, history, myth tribe. And wow, you are a general in this tribe. So thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it.
Great conversation. I'll have to check out your podcast more. It sounds like you're doing some interesting stuff here.
So good. So amazing. I mean, how does someone become a CarrieLynn Reinhard in life? She's who I want to be when I grow up.
I'm just trying every day. One day I'll get there.
One of the things, Torri, as we wrap up this episode that is really interesting to me that we really haven't addressed is I remember there was a huge debate when I was growing up about, is wrestling fake? Is wrestling real? Is wrestling fake? And that was like a thing for so many years. And then I remember we sort of got to this place with pro wrestling where it was just common knowledge. Okay, yes, the outcomes are predetermined. This is about the narrative. It's about the story. And it doesn't matter if it's fake or not.
That is the thing. It does not matter. Who cares?
Right.
Just enjoy the show.
Yes. In some ways, I was always worried it would be proven fake. And of course it was. But in some sense, it became more powerful to me when I found out that this was a narrative. It was being scripted and that there was meaning and purpose behind this. And I just wonder if we can take that as sort of a lesson in so many other parts of life. I think sometimes we're worried about the wrong questions in life. And if we can just embrace something for what it is, and then what can we learn from it? What can we enjoy about it? And just like Joseph Campbell used to say about mythology, people in so many religious traditions are worried about, is my mythology true? Is what we believe religiously true? And Joseph Campbell would say, actually, these myths are more than true. They're more powerful than if they were literal historical events. And I think that, for me, is sort of the big takeaway about professional wrestling is there's a reason why the popularity of like college wrestling or high school wrestling doesn't even compare, or even Olympic wrestling doesn't even compare with professional wrestling, because these stories don't need to be literal true stories. They're more than true.
Exactly. They're telling bigger ideas than two people are fighting.
Yes.
Two people are fighting everywhere in the world.
Yes. Wow.
But two people aren't fighting to protect their undead brother.
That's right.
Or
That's right.
These are bigger stories than we can even imagine.
Yeah.
And I think you hit the nail on the head with, is my mythology true? It doesn't matter. What did you learn from this?
That's right.
What did you gain from this? And I guarantee you, if you look at the stories of Olympus, or if you go to a WrestleMania, you're going to learn something from it.
Wow. I can't think of a better way to end. That is amazing. Brother. Well, if people want to get a hold of us, they can contact us at skeletonkeys.podcast@gmail.com. Where can they find us on the socials?
You can follow us on the socials at Skeleton Keys Pod on Twitter and Instagram. You can follow us individually. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Torri Yates-Orr. That is TorriYatesOrr. I'm
on Twitter at John K. Booker, Bucher. I'm on Instagram at Telling a Better Story. Torri, it's been an amazing episode. I can't wait to see what we dig into next. Come join us next week. This has been the Skeleton Keys Podcast. See you next time.